is about R3. We have Harrison Comfort, who is the commercial director at R3, and he's going to take us through the Corda blockchain. So please give him a big round of applause.
So Harrison Comfort, I started R3 in December of 2015. I was employee number 9. I guess just to give a little bit of a history of R3, it's interesting. So our CEO's name is David Rudder, so that's what the R stands for. And initially, the company was meant to be named R5 because he has 5 children, but that was taken from a trademarking perspective. So R3 it was. And the only reason I feel comfortable saying that is his eldest son, Pat, is my best friend. So maybe there was a little bit of nepotism going on, I don't know. But before we start, how many people have heard of blockchain? Okay, majority, okay. And roughly in the audience, how many would consider themselves to be technical of any sort? Okay, that's good, a mix. So basically what R3 is, it is an alliance, it is an ecosystem of some of the world's largest financial institutions, and we are an enterprise software company. The original objective of R3 actually we had Corda, which is the name of our distributed ledger technology that we've built with some of the world's largest financial institutions. It's over 100. We have over 40 investors. Actually, our initial round, we had 44 investors, but you won't see any of that in any of the public briefings because I guess in China and some of the Asian countries, the number 44 is very bad luck. It means double death, so you don't actually see that number anywhere. So the original use case of R3 and why it was started was to explore potentially the use of distributed ledger technology for financial institutions. So there was Bitcoin, there was Ethereum, there were a lot of public blockchains, and our CTO, Richard Gendel-Brown, who used to be an executive architect at IBM, his original mandate was to discover whether or not distributed ledger technology would be suitable at all for financially regulated institutions. And with himself and Mike Hearn, who was one of the original Bitcoin developers, he actually just did a Reddit series, Ask Me Anything, which received quite a lot of attention. What they decided was, in fact, no, none of the public blockchains would be suitable for financially regulated institutions, so we should create our own. So here's just a snapshot of some of our ecosystem. The network is quite large, and I just think the punchline is that there are a lot of blockchains out there, and specifically Corda, which is the one that we have developed at R3, is specifically for regulated financial institutions. I'm not going to sit up here and say Corda is the only blockchain that there ever is going to be. However, I do think that it is the ideal choice when you're talking about anything for banks, insurance companies, anything along those lines. And I guess if there's just 2 things that you take away from, sort of who R3 is and what R3 is, like if you just remember these 2 things, I would consider this a massive success, is that R3 has nothing to do with Bitcoin or any cryptocurrencies. And the other one is that we don't actually build top-of-stack applications. So Corda fundamentally is a platform. It's a distributed ledger technology platform. And if you don't know what distributed ledger technology is, just think of it as a means of sharing information between multiple parties in a way in which you can cryptographically assure what you're looking at is what I'm looking at. Our chief engineer has this saying that shared perception is truth. So that's sort of a helpful way to think about it. What you're looking at is what I'm looking at. And there's a means of governing that sort of evolving set of facts or shared information. So you could imagine for some sort of financial trade, which you and I are a participant on, it would be extremely useful if there was a shared sort of, your version of the trade is the same as my version of the trade. So you might have heard of this notion of there's an element of having a shared database of sorts. That's kind of how I think a lot of the initial deployments are, is that your record of something is the same as my record of something, and if we're in agreement on that, you can enable all sorts of other functionalities. So the punchline is that we work with a lot of different members of the ecosystem. We only have 150 members, so I'd like to think that we punch quite a bit above our weight. And so sort of on the infrastructure and technology partner side, one of the benefits of R3 and Corda is that we offer maximum flexibility in terms of your sort of deployment environments, on-prem, cloud. If you're interested in working with some of the hardware providers up as well, that's something that we sort of defer to the end users who are deploying Corda nodes. We have relationships with them and help drive different deployment architectures. On the side, since we don't build top-of-stack applications, that was the second sort of punchline, we need to sort of arm the world in terms of entities who are able to build on Corda and integrate into Corda. That's not a core competency of ours. So we partner with all these guys on the left, and they effectively are the ones who are going to be building the actual applications, since we don't. So in a lot of RFPs, it actually is a bit confusing. We're ultimately a subcontractor to a lot of them for a lot of the solutions that are looking to be solved in the market. And then the top guys, these are my favorite. I should give a shout out to Finastra, because Maxon invited me to speak. Works at Finastra. We're working very publicly with Finastra on a syndicated loan solution. And I think that the reason that that's a brilliant use case is sort of like what makes a good distributed ledger technology use case, especially for Corda, is anytime you have multiple members within an ecosystem that need to be sharing and looking at the same piece of data or information. So in that particular example, you have an agent bank who is effectively syndicating a loan from a large corporate borrower, right? Because in that particular situation, like American Airlines, for example, if they're raising money, call it $1 billion, Barclays can't hold all of that money on its books. The FCA or the regulators, they would go crazy. This is insane, you can't have all this exposure. So they syndicate or distribute all that risk out to the market. And then they are legally contracted. They need to govern the evolution of that syndicated loan facility, ensure that all the lenders, et cetera, get paid. So you could understand how in that very situation it would be super useful if all of the lenders who were party to that particular loan facility, they were all in consensus on what was being represented and sort of the evolving nature from an asset servicing perspective. Things like interest payments, covenants, et cetera. So that's sort of the general model. We have these members who are effectively and investors who are the ones who are dictating to us where the market demand is for applications. So LenderCon, for example, has a ton of interest. Another project of ours that has received a lot of interest in the trade finance space is Marco Polo. And the me of LenderCon is here as well as my colleague Sophie. She's the one who's a project manager for Marco Polo. And we work with a lot of these institutions, and we have partners who are building the top of stack applications, and it can be an ISV, it can be a systems integration firm, but the end goal is having applications built on Corda. Our number one objective is massive Corda adoption. It's our Corda ubiquity, as we would call it. So in terms of talking a little bit about Corda, it's the blockchain basically designed for financially regulated institutions and the representation of assets on an enterprise basis. And just taking a step back, I would be remiss not to mention, especially for the technical people in the room, that Corda is open source. You can literally go download it now and spin up a node. And we open source Corda. Actually, the first line of Corda was written in November of 2015. And I believe it was December of a little over a year later, we open sourced the technology. We've had 2 subsequent releases. So when you see V3 here, that's a huge milestone, especially from the technical people in the room. So what that means is that if you build an application on Corda, from here on after, our promise is that any future versions will be compatible with what you build today. Not only from an API perspective, from a wire stability perspective as well. And we're also building an enterprise version of Corda. It's our vision that in the future, you'll have applications running with Corda and R3 Corda. So when people ask, well, what's the R3 business model? We're building an enterprise version of the solution that we feel will have some of the additional features that will help meet some of the non-functional requirements to banks. So things like high availability, disaster recovery. One that we've actually worked quite closely with our partners around is, well, in a distributed system, everybody has a node, right? So your own access to the ledger. So you can imagine if you have your node sitting behind the firewall, that would imply if you have 100, 200, 300, whatever the number is, different counterparties, that you have to open up your firewall hundreds of times. At a bank, that would be absurd. That right there would be an absolute showstopper, right? So that feature to support that type of a deployment is something that we would look to include in the enterprise version of R3 Corda. But sort of Corda in 30 seconds, if you will. There's this notion of a state object. So this is going to be a little bit more technical, but effectively just think of a state as there's a shared fact on ledger. It can be information about a trade. It can be information about a particular asset, whatever it is. And the key thing, and we'll get into this in a moment, is the differentiating factor from Corda versus other blockchains is you only see what's relevant to you. So there's this notion of you have a state object, a shared fact that is only shared with anybody who's related to that particular trade. Anybody who needs to see it, sees it. So kind of, you know, a really silly example would be like, I don't know if any of you guys use Slack or something like that, right? You have the opportunity to send a direct message to somebody, only you see that message. That's sort of maybe an oversimplified way of thinking about it, but it's rather than broadcasting it to that general channel, you're able to message sort of bilaterally with the people who are relevant. Then there's this notion of a transaction. And I can't tell you how much confusion that word, it's crazy how important naming is, but that particular word creates so much confusion because what we mean by transaction in Corda is just an update to the ledger. So anytime there's in a syndicated loan example, if you have someone paying down a facility, the interest rate change, anything like that, in Corda speak, that just means an update to ledger. And the key thing is that your update to ledger is only what you see. So that sort of ties into consensus. And when you think about consensus, it's like, all right, so there's a shared fact that we're in agreement upon. You propose a transaction, you propose an update to ledger. How do we agree that that update is valid? So in Corda, there's actually 3 ways in which you can think about consensus. There's this notion of smart contracts, which is it's a word I feel like that gets thrown around a lot in blockchain. Sounds sort of sexy, right? Like smart contracts will solve all your problems. But in Corda speak, we actually think of it more like a dumb contract. So it's basically, think of it, a list of 100 things that need to be true in order for that potential proposal or a transaction to be valid. Because in Corda, transactions are atomic. So you think about there's this smart contract was effectively codifying a legal agreement of sorts. There is the digital signature, right? So if you're a party to a transaction, similar to how it works in the real world, there needs to be fundamentally some signature of anything, any sort of update that's happening on ledger. And the third piece is really around what we call a notary. Again, not necessarily the best term, but effectively it is a service that attests the uniqueness of a transaction in time to ensure no double spend or anything like that. And the flow framework, this is another key differentiator with Corda in the sense that it effectively is a choreography of sorts to help enable the verification and validation around business processes. So a lot of developers who build on Corda think that it's a really elegant and helpful technology to use as a result of this flow framework. So we sort of touched on this earlier, but when you think about Corda and how, the ledger, if you will, in some of the public blockchains, there's really just one ledger. Everybody sees everything. But the key difference on Corda, and you can see sort of by these circles in terms of who sees what, is that you only see what's relevant to you. So there's not one ledger. There's actually sort of an indefinite number of bilateral ledgers or an indefinite number of ledgers as it relates to the very specific facts that should be shared by the parties, right? So, the trades between Alice and Bob, Alice can't see what Bob's doing with Carl. However, there is this notion that it's not just purely bilateral, that we do contemplate the fact that there's going to be more than one or two parties to a transaction. So this is just a nice sort of overall diagram in terms of how we would think about, shared facts, if you will, on ledger, state objects. And another thing here, which is just helpful to point out, is that just because you put something on ledger, it doesn't mean you necessarily need to share it, right? So number 11 over there in Alice's bubble, that's something that's just in her node. So you'll hear this term a lot, like, what is the node? It's in Corda, you can think of it as sort of two things. It stores all of your shared facts that are relevant to you, but maybe a sort of easier way to think about it is it's sort of your gateway, or it's your means of accessing the ledger and transacting on the ledger and sending messages to other nodes and initiating that flow framework that we talked about, which would be revolved around any sort of transaction or update to ledger that might be relevant to any of the trades that you're working on. So another thing, and we haven't been very public about this until recently. So the whole point, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? We're trying to solve this problem of isolated assets, where what's happening in the trade finance department of an institution is completely separate, not only from a manual process perspective, but just in order to be interoperable, we use this word, from other asset classes within that particular institution. So you can imagine, very simplistically, if you were a bank and you had a trade finance department, right, fundamentally in a lot of trade finance departments and a lot of trade finance trades, there's an underlying collateral associated with that. So you could imagine as a large institution, you might have another side of the house that is extending insurance on that very trade in some sort of capacity down the line. And oh, by the way, there's also a fundamental know your client or KYC type functionality that would need to interoperate or be able to potentially be relevant, right? So rather than the trade finance department having to do its own KYC, it could mutualize the work that's been done within that existing bank on that same client. You could think about how this would streamline so many operations and reduce so much manual entry and reconciliation. I mean, to be honest, this stuff is not, like, the problem that we're solving is not sexy, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is allow financial institutions to focus on the things that matter to them and would differentiate them, right? Nobody banks at Santander over Barclays because Santander is better at settlement, right? Right? That's not why, or they're better at clearing trades. They go to Santander over Barclays because, you know, for strategic reasons, because of the relationships, for all the things that are differentiators from institutions. So there's this notion around mutualizing a lot of the non-core business processes around what makes financial institutions run. So what we're trying to establish with this concept of core to connect, and we're not married to the name, but if you have a ledger where everybody has a node and they have some common things in which they agree on, specifically things like identity, specifically on the means in which they send information to each other, right? Like how do you look up one identity on the ledger that's running a different application? But also this notion of how can you trust what's happening in the KYC application over there if I'm in the trade finance application over here? So this notion of distributed governance. So if everybody who's part of this global network, if you will, agrees on these very simple parameters, it enables partners like Finastra to build an application, and to the extent they want to plug into a settlement application or basically enable some sort of seamless cash transfer, which might be a different app built by somebody else, it would enable that. That's fundamentally what we're trying to solve. It's this notion of asset fungibility. And really the prize, if I'm honest with you, is this notion of delivery versus payment, such that you have a world where you can trade a bond for a mortgage-backed security or a syndicated loan or some trade finance asset, and all of the corresponding clearing and settlement and reporting associated with that trade all happens seamlessly in real time in a way that's transparent. And I sort of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but you know, I'd be remiss not to mention that how we think about deployment and architecture, we want to give the community as much flexibility as possible. You know, some folks want to have it on-prem, other folks want cloud deployments, sometimes there's a mix. And of course, there's also different hardware and the like from an infrastructure perspective that folks want to be considering for their particular application. So at R3, one of the things that we try and do is not have any sort of exclusivity with anyone. And it really, this and around the deployment, we want to just have as much flexibility as possible. So that's sort of how we think about that from that perspective. And maybe just to throw up a sort of comparison, you know, this is geared towards a technical audience. But if you're sort of thinking to yourself, okay, well, you know, how is Corda different than some of the other blockchains that seem to get thrown around, especially when you're talking about financial use cases? You know, whether you're talking about IBM's Fabric or Ethereum, I think really there's three ways to sort of generally think about it. The first is really the notion of consensus, right? This notion of, in Corda, consensus or agreement on a shared fact only occurs for the parties that are relevant to that fact. There's no broadcast. So some of the other sort of public blockchains have this notion of if something happens, you're going to broadcast it to everybody. And to be honest, in certain use cases, that makes a lot of sense. Like provenance, like if you're using DLT because you want to track, you know, it sounds like a joke, but there's some like consumer companies that have use cases around like meat. Beef chain. How do you assure that the meat that you're buying at a grocery store in fact came from I don't know what the equivalent is here, but in America it's the USDA, you know, or it's a regulatory approved type of meat, right? In that situation, a public or a gossip network would be great. You would want to see everything. But in other situations, like if you're talking about OTC derivatives and there's some you know, business differentiating information that could be surmised for that trade, whether it was the amount, the price, how it was structured, etc., right? If you wouldn't want your competitors knowing that information, right? So there's this notion around confidentiality that I think Corda helps solve really, really elegantly. Another is this notion of building on industry standard tools, right? So Corda runs in Java Virtual Machine. It attempts to use industry standards like relational database management systems. There's this notion of AMQP messaging. So the intent was to make it as easy for developers to get started and bootstrap their own environments. And I guess the third thing, well, I alluded to it on the prior two slides, is around just general deployment flexibility. There's no, here are certain, how should I say, infrastructures or certain cloud deployments that are required or needed or bundled with what the offering is, so there's flexibility from that perspective. But our CTO wrote a blog post around this interoperability that I was speaking about earlier, Corda Connect. How do you have applications of different asset classes able to interoperate and talk to each other such that they can recognize what's going on in one place is truly being recognized somewhere else. So our CTO, Richard Brown, wrote a really great blog post around that. So we should definitely send that around as well. And yeah, I mean, that's sort of the overview. In terms of some projects that we're working on, we talked about LenderCom earlier. So it's a syndicated loan. It's a syndicated loan application. Effectively, it's looking to automate and digitize asset servicing as it relates to syndicated loans. Which, if you don't know what a syndicated loan is, think of it like a mortgage, but instead of a human, it's a large corporate, and instead of one bank, you're dealing with 100 banks potentially. And generally, the use of proceeds is for things like acquisitions, recapitalizations, refinancings, etc. But the thing is like, okay, that sounds great, and in the fact that, okay, you have a shared database, okay. Distributed ledger technology on its own isn't the only problem that can solve this notion of what you see is what I see. But the thing that's amazing is once you have this fundamental layer is the subsequent functionality that you can enable. So you could imagine a world sort of coming full circle with the vision that you have lenders who are part privy to a particular deal. They're able to potentially seamlessly trade. This notion of secondary trading. So right now in the syndicated loan market, settlement can take up to 19 days. 19 days! That is insane. Snail mail. I don't even know if that's crazy. But you go from 19 days to hours, that saves so much balance sheet, that saves so much operational risk, and you get the people at these institutions focusing on what makes them better than another institution versus another. So there's a roadmap, I guess, is the main takeaway from when you think about these products. And I guess another one, which is one that I alluded to earlier, is in our trade finance strategy around open account. So open account trade. So interestingly, the vast majority of trade that happens in the world is roughly an $18 trillion asset class worldwide. The vast majority of it has no actual underlying financing associated from a bank. So there's this massive called open account market that actually does not receive any financing for a trade. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. But the punchline is that if you're able to offer a more seamless, automated, digitized experience, you could potentially capture some of this massive market share of corporates and SMEs who are not getting any financing today. And as a result of having enhanced transparency and data quality, financial institutions would be much more willing to offer financing to those institutions. So there's just tremendous white space that could potentially be enabled from having this type of a platform. So I think that is it. I don't know if it's